Hello, my name's Chris, what's yours? Welcome back to Marathon Man, where I'm going through the history of James Bond, looking at every novel and film in release order with little pit stops to take a look at other media which came out in between. And you join me at something of a curio. Look, as Bond fans, we all know this exists, and because we live in the future now, it's ready available to watch. But I remember having to hunt for this. In 1954, CBS paid Ian Fleming the sum of $1,000 to be able to adapt Casino Royale into an episode of its anthology series Climax. It was the third ever episode, aired in October of 1954, and it is obviously notable as the first visualisation of James Bond on either the big or the small screen. I'd read about this in Bond reference books throughout the 90s as I grew from a little Bond fan at the beginning of the decade into a fully fledged Bond nerd as the decade wore on. But it was so out of reach, at least for me. Thing is, there are plenty of times throughout the years where James Bond could have died. Had the films not taken off, the character could have died with Fleming. Can we really say that the continuation novels by Kingsley Amis, John Gardner, etc. would have happened without the Eon James Bond films? The Kingsley Amis one maybe, but I don't think it would have come back in the 80s with Gardner had the Eon films not been as big as they were. But the films did take off, and so this curious first slice of screen James Bond became vastly important. In what felt like a miracle, I found it on VHS about 25 years ago while idly browsing the videos in HMV, and it's got a really smug blurb on the back. Can you name the actors who played Ian Fleming's superhero James Bond 007? Well, there's Sean Connery, Roger Moore, George Lazenby, David Niven, Timothy Dalton and Pierce Brosnan, right? Although they do spell Piers wrong. Wrong. You've missed one. Yeah, alright. Barry Nelson. I couldn't believe my luck and I excitedly bought the last copy in the shop. I'd read all about it in various books on the Bond phenomenon and I had always wanted to see it. It was a gap in my Bond experience, and quite a considerable gap too. The fact that there was a filmed adaptation of Casino Royale, no less, that wasn't the 1967 spoof, and that I hadn't seen, frankly, it just felt unacceptable. Especially as Eon were almost certainly never going to do an official filmed adaptation of it. I already knew that Bond was American in it, and was called Card Sense Jimmy Bond. I knew that Leiter was British and named Clarence Leiter instead, and I knew that Vesper and Mathis had been combined to form Valerie. As an aside, how odd is it to imagine an alt 2006 Casino Royale where Bond and Mathis have the love story and Vesper is nowhere to be seen? Like, it amuses me no end. But despite knowing all that, forearmed wasn't necessarily forewarned. I don't think I was completely prepared for what I saw when I popped that VHS in when I got it home. Despite knowing how the Bond canon would unfold after this point, and that this was essentially an anomaly at that odd stage in Bond's life where his first novel had been a modest hit, but he wasn't yet a cultural juggernaut, it was still incredibly jarring. I can forgive some of the fluffs given that it was done live, but I can't say that I truly ever enjoy watching Card Sense Jimmy Bond. And it's worth pointing out that what feels like sacrilege now would have been far less heinous changes to the text at the time. Now, I'm not saying that it improves upon the novel, it absolutely does not. But it's not completely incomprehensible to understand why they made the changes that they did. These days, they wouldn't have made Bond American. These days, Bond is British. But these days, Bond has been around for over 70 years and is a giant of popular culture. At this point, he'd been in precisely 2 books, and the second of which was only out fairly recently, and not even in the territory this TV episode was released. So if he's not known as a character to the masses, why wouldn't you make some changes to make him as palatable as possible to your intended audience? Again, I'm not saying that making Bond American was the right thing to do. It absolutely was not. But if you're making an episode of an American anthology TV show and you're adapting the plot of a fairly pulpy novel that not many people watching will have read, they may well have asked why on earth were they watching some Brit play cards. I don't agree with the decisions, but I can understand some of them. And it is worth pointing out that the pedigree of some of the people involved in this is surprisingly high, even promising for an inaugural James Bond adaptation, especially for one this infamous. For one of the scriptwriters was Charles Bennett, who had been an actor and a playwright, a notable work being the 1928 stage play Blackmail, which impressed Alfred Hitchcock enough to make it into one of Britain's first ever sound films the following year. He would work with Hitchcock quite a bit, collaborating on a Bulldog Drummond screenplay, which eventually became The Man Who Knew Too Much. Also for Hitchcock, he wrote The 39 Steps, Secret Agent, Sabotage, Young and Innocent, and he did some work on Foreign Correspondent, for which he was nominated for an Oscar. So while this slice of Bond curiosity does get regarded with caution, it can sometimes be forgotten that it was written by an Oscar-nominated screenwriter who worked extensively with Alfred Hitchcock. That's what I mean about pedigree. And it doesn't stop there, either. With Hitchcock maybe being the byword for espionage and suspense at the time, another of his regular collaborators was cast in the role of Le Chiffre, none other than Peter Actual Lorre. And on top of that, some of the music is by Jerry Goldsmith. That's Jerry Goldsmith. I think what I'm trying to say is that we remember this with a sliding scale of disdain and ridicule, a luxurious position with hindsight knowing full well what a behemoth James Bond would become. But no matter how janky the end result, they put some effort into this. Despite not being a character from the book, Linda Christian is really quite good as Valerie, and it does make me wish she'd played a more faithful iteration of Vesper. She could have likely done the ending of the book quite a bit of justice. But however small the plot of Casino Royale might be in comparison with future James Bond stories, it's still too much for a 60-minute episode on limited sets. And so, there are stretches of the book which just have to be jettisoned. And beyond the simple matter of time constraints, there are certain parts of this story that obviously cannot be put on TV in 1954. The tied naked to a chair and genitals flayed by a carpet beater is obviously not going to make it in. However, the makers realise that the scene is vital, and so they find another way, an alternative method of torture to include it, and the toe pliering is probably about as nasty as it could have got. Lorre, who is an incredibly well-cast Le Chiffre, plays that scene, as he does most of his scenes, excellently. So excellently, in fact, that even though he is dream casting for a Bond villain, I don't actually mourn the fact that he never appeared in any of the Eon films, because we weren't actually denied Lorre's Bond villain. He's here, and he's great. To be honest, he makes it for me. Beyond the novelty factor, which, by the way, shouldn't be underestimated, because this has got it in spades. More on that in a little bit. Lorre's the only reason that I would rewatch this. He is exactly the Le Chiffre I picture when I read the novel. He is the perfect Le Chiffre. Just imagine him delivering the Dear Boy speech in its entirety. Like, chills. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of Card Sense Jimmy Bond. Tempting though it is to lay that all at the feet of Barry Nelson, I'm going to resist doing that. He is not a good James Bond, but he is miscast. It's obvious now, 70 years later, that part of the reason Bond works is his Britishness. Back then, hastily adapting what many thought was a trashy potboiler, they're looking at the plot, and Bond being British may not be a deal breaker. Unfortunately for them, and Barry, it is. As James Bond, Nelson doesn't work. But as a lead in any other spy caper, he'd have probably been fine. One of the main issues this production has is a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is that would make this character work. Too focused on the story being king when we know now that the character of James Bond happens to be probably bigger than any story he's in. And Nelson kind of confirmed this in a 2004 interview he did with Cinema Retro. The book had only been published in the States 6 months before, which gives the intended audience for this TV show, very little time to get acquainted with the character of James Bond. At that time, no one had ever heard of James Bond. I was scratching my head wondering how to play it. I hadn't read the book or anything like that because it wasn't well known. The worst part of it was that I learned it was to be done live. I thought I was finished with live TV. I was trying to get out of it, actually. Now, he doesn't necessarily play it like he's trying to get out of it. He's professional enough to turn that reluctance into a kind of cocky American indifference on Bond's part. But cocky American indifference is not a cornerstone of James Bond's character because, obviously, as we've said many times, James Bond is not American. But this is no fault of Nelson, not really. He's been hired to play a part and is playing it with very little understanding or familiarity with the character, and presumably very little guidance on the part of his producers and director, who also have very little grasp on the character. At this point, they are adapting Casino Royale. They are not adapting James Bond. James Bond is now bigger than any story he's in, like I said. At the time, though, they're adapting a book. They're not adapting the man. It sounds strange to get so hung up on it, I suppose, but it really doesn't work, switching Bond's nationality to American. Fleming's writing is so incredibly evocative that it's frighteningly effective, and he has imbued his lead character with such a perspective and outlook that he simply has to be British to work as a character. What also doesn't help is that it is a rushed condensing of the book into a 60-minute time slot. Combined with that lack of understanding of Bond as a character, then it hasn't got the surest foundations. Because in the same interview, Nelson also said, "They were making changes up to the last minute. There was nothing you could do if anything went wrong. I was very conscious of the fact that there wasn't much to go on. It was too superficial." So aside from Laurie, it really is that novelty factor that carries me through any viewings of this. Because yes, sometimes I will put this on because I fancy it. And why is that? Well, the reason that sort of feeling is, I think, so very potent when it comes to Bond fans is that James Bond now is such a recognisable brand, and his custodians are so very protective and methodical in how they approach it, that it can actually be quite exhilarating and immensely fascinating when you get the opportunity to watch other people have a go. It's why Never Say Never Again can, in the right frame of mind, be an interesting watch. It's why the 1967 adaptation of Casino Royale is so fascinating, and it's why the Martin Jarvis BBC radio adaptations can be exciting listens. We're so used to James Bond in performed media being done through a particular lens that it can be strangely and entertainingly discombobulating watching another perspective on it. It can pack a punch, and the same is true here. Even though this did come a full 8 years before Dr. No, we can't help but view it as a curio because the films took off in the way they did. In fact, we can't help but view it at all because the films took off in the way they did. If they hadn't, would this even still be assessed today? Who knows? Either way, Casino Royale, this Casino Royale, is, for better or for worse, viewed through a prism. And unfortunately, that prism is less than kind. There is still enjoyment to be had, but I think that's because of three things: Peter Lorre, Linda Christian, and the fact that it's such an odd journey down a rabbit hole. Peter Lorre. Either the laughable assassination attempt that opens the show, or Barry Nelson himself. Sorry, Baz, you're good, but you're not Bond. Again, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this sideways tumble into an alternate Bond universe, then you know how YouTube works. Please do hit the like thumb and share it around. It'd be great to get as many Bond fans as possible along for the Supermarathon. And what do you think of the Casino Royale TV special? Is it an absolute abomination, or is there enough charm here for it to be a real hidden gem? Is Peter Lorre one of the greatest Bond villains ever, or does the fact that he's in this and not an official Ian Bond film mean that you discount him out of principle? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here soon for Ian Fleming's third Bond novel, Moonraker. So if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button, bong the bell, and I'll meet you in Blades for some bridge.